Hi, just a quick reminder that this podcast has merch, a Patreon, a Fiverr gig, and some affiliated links. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. Alright, now enjoy the show. I have to give a content warning in this episode. I mention alcoholism, so listener discretion is advised. This story goes from the cold mines of Wales to the bright lights of Hollywood to the mountains of Switzerland, from the stage to the screen, and from one tumultuous relationship to the next. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 13th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. Welcome to Season 5 of History Shelf. This season is titled History, Taylor's Version. That is because these 14 people I will be covering this season all have one thing in common. The one thing they have in common is they all have been name dropped in a Taylor Swift song. Now, don't stop listening if you are not a fellow Swiftie like me. This season is not going to be about Taylor Swift. You don't have to be a Swiftie to enjoy this season. You just have to be a history lover. So please, stay. What we are going to do is you and I are going to go on a little adventure that spans 2,404 years. Who I am going to cover this season are fearless leaders, people from the screen, poets straight from the Tortured Poets department, and people who were just trying to find a place in this world. Some of these stories may be stories of happiness. They may be sad, beautiful, tragic. But long story short, I hope that you will be enchanted to get to know the stories of these historical figures all too well. So, are you ready for it? For this week, I am talking about Richard Burton. Before I get talking about Richard Burton, I just want to say that sorry that I had to take last week off. Things have just been really stressful, and I needed more time to get this episode together. So, having said that, let's get talking about Richard Burton. Richard Burton was born Richard Walter Jenkins, Jr. on November 10th, 1925 in Pontrhydyfen, Wales. Richard is the second and last person from Wales that I will be covering this season. The first one was the subject of the last episode, Dylan Thomas. Back in either the Aristotle or Cleopatra episode, I said I wasn't going to be covering this season anyone from a country that I have not covered before and have a listener in, but I totally forgot that Dylan Thomas and Richard Burton were both from Wales. This also is like the third time this season that someone's episode is dropping not on their birthday, but really close to it, and it just worked out that way. And it's going to happen again next week. But enough about the people that I have covered in the past and will cover in the future. Let's get back to the present and Richard Burton. When I did the Dylan Thomas episode, I used the English pronunciation of his name instead of the Welsh pronunciation because he preferred the English pronunciation. Now, when it comes to Richard Burton's family, I don't know if they preferred the English pronunciation of their names or the Welsh. So I'm going to use the Welsh pronunciation since I can't ask them which one that they preferred. And if you have listened to any of my other previous episodes where I've covered another country, I want to use the correct pronunciation. I try to, at least. I know sometimes I probably butchered it, but I do try, and I'm going to try this time. Richard's mother was Edith Mydra Thomas, and his father was Richard Walter Jenkins Sr. I looked it up to see if Richard and Dylan Thomas were related, and from what I can tell, they were not. I wasn't able to find out all of the information on his siblings, but I did find that Richard was the 12th child of 13 children. 11 of the 13 children survived into adulthood. The 2 that did not survive into adulthood were 2 girls, and they were both named Margaret. Richard had at least 3 sisters that survived into adulthood. They were Cecilia, Edea, and Hilda. And he had 5 brothers that survived into adulthood, at least 5 brothers. And they were Ivor, Verdun, David, Thomas, and Graham. Richard grew up poor. Richard's father was a coal miner and his mother was a barmaid. His father was also a gambler with an alcohol addiction. Richard's parents had actually gotten married against the will of his mother's parents. When they got married, Richard's mother was underage, and they had to lie about her age since they did not have her parents' consent. Edith's parents disowned her when they found out about her marriage, and she was stuck with an abusive alcoholic husband for the rest of her life. Richard's father had a nickname. His nickname was Little Dick, and that's what I'm going to refer to him as for the rest of this episode because I find that nickname quite fitting. Little Dick would go on drinking binges, which would cause Edith to not have enough money to feed her children. Richard hardly knew his mother because she died when he was almost 2 years old. Edith gave birth to her last child, her son, Graham, on October 25th, 1927. She became ill shortly after the birth. Edith wanted to go to the hospital when she was diagnosed with septicemia, but Little Dick refused to give her the money so she could go. 6 days later, on October 31st, Edith died at the age of 45. Her exposure to the dust from the coal mines resulted in her death. After Edith died, Little Dick did not raise Richard. Richard's sister, Cecilia, whom he affectionately called Keith, took him in to live with her and her husband, Elfed James, and their 2 daughters, Mariam and Shemam. Richard was 11 years old when he passed his scholarship exams, becoming the first in his family to go to grammar school. Richard had an excellent speaking and singing voice, even at a young age. He won an Eisteddfod prize as a boy soprano. Eisteddfod is a festival in Welsh culture, and there are several competitions during the festival. Richard wanted to win a second time, and that was when he turned to Philip Burton. Philip was Richard's schoolmaster. Richard asked Philip to help him because Richard wanted to sing a challenging song titled Orpheus with his flute. Richard's voice, though, kept cracking when they would practice. Richard started getting active in theater. His first role was a minor role in his school's production of The Apple Cart. Richard left school in 1941 to work as a coal miner because his brother-in-law could no longer work, but Richard was not fit enough for the coal mines. He ended up getting many odd jobs like running messages, hauling horse manure, and delivering newspapers. And he eventually found work in the men's outfitters department at Tybach Cooperative. After that, Richard didn't really know what he was going to do with his life. He was struggling with trying to find a place in this world. He was weighing his options about what career path he would go down. Would he go into boxing, religion, singing? Richard didn't know. Richard's name wasn't the only thing that he got from his father. He also got his father's love of drinking. Around this time of uncertainty, Richard began drinking and smoking even though he was underage. Richard ended up joining the Port Talbot Squadron 499 of the Air Training Corps section of the Royal Air Force as a cadet. This made his path cross again with Philip Burton. During this time, Richard also joined the Tybach Youth Center that was founded by one of Richard's old teachers, Meredith Jones. It was led by a man named Leo Lloyd. Leo took Richard under his wing and taught him acting. Philip gave Richard a part in a radio adaptation of his play Youth at the Helm for BBC Radio. Both Meredith and Philip readmitted Richard to school on October 5th, 1942. Philip then started to work with Richard. They worked on Richard's voice. Philip thought that Richard needed to lose his thick Welsh accent. Together, they worked on voice projection. Philip tried to adopt Richard, but Philip was too young. He had to be 21 years or older than Richard, and Philip was 20 days too young. But Philip did become Richard's legal guardian in December of 1943, and that was when Richard's name went from Richard Jenkins to Richard Burton. Philip became Richard's guardian because they believed that Richard would have a better chance at getting into Oxford University if he was the son of a school teacher. Richard did get into Exeter College, Oxford, for 6 months as part of a Royal Air Force training course. While at Exeter College, Richard was in the play Measure for Measure, written by History Shelf alumni William Shakespeare. Philip gave Richard some last-minute acting coaching before his performance. Richard really impressed two audience members. They were actor John Gielgud and theater producer Hugh Beaumont, and they discussed with him an acting contract following World War II. After Oxford, Richard started his Royal Air Force training, serving in bases in Norfolk, Gloucestershire, and Wiltshire, but he would leave every now and then to perform radio productions. He also went to Canada with the Royal Air Force. During this time, Richard's drinking and smoking got worse. He also had a brief fling with the actress Eleanor Summerfield. Richard was discharged from the Royal Air Force on December 16, 1947. 1948 was the year that Richard moved to London, England. He met with Hugh Beaumont. Hugh put him under a contract of £500 per year. He got a minor role in a film called Castle Anna. He was cast in the film by Daphne Rye. Like with Clara Bow, I am not going to list all of Richard's movies, but I will go over the highlights. Richard's first mainstream film was The Last Days of Dotwin. Emlyn Williams wrote that role just for him. On the set of that film, he met the actress Sybil Williams. Richard started a relationship with Sybil. They were married on February 5th, 1949 at a registrar's office in Kensington. Together, Richard and Sybil had two daughters. Catherine was born on September 10th, 1957, and their second daughter, Jessica, was born in 1959. A little side note, Catherine, who goes by Kate, went on to become an actress. And if any Grey's Anatomy fans are listening, Kate played Meredith's mother, Ellis, on Grey's Anatomy. Richard was praised for his work on The Last Days of Dotwin. The film's co-producer, Alexander Korda, offered Richard a contract at £100 a week, and Richard signed it. Richard had small roles receiving praise for them. He had a bigger role in Green Grow the Rushes. It was a bomb at the box office, though. Daphne Rye recommended that he played Hephaestion in the play Alexander the Great Adventure Story, but the director, Peter Glenville, thought that he was too short. But Daphne then got him a part in the play The Ladies Not for Burning. It had a successful run for a year. Richard received his first major award for this performance. It was the Theatre World Award. Richard went on to act in some more plays, including The Boy with a Cart. The director of that play, John Gielgud, remember he showed up earlier, said that Richard's performance was one of the most beautiful performances he had ever seen. As Richard's career progressed, critics dubbed him the next Laurence Olivier. When Richard played in the plays Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2, theater critic Kenneth Timon said this about Richard's performance, quote, "His playing of Prince Hal turned interested speculation to all almost as soon as he started to speak. In the first intermission, local critics stood agape in the lobbies," end quote. He went on to play in Henry V and The Tempest, though critics weren't fans of those. Richard's first film was My Cousin Rachel. This was the only film that Little Dick saw, and he only saw half of it. He left the theater to go to a pub because he said that the film had too much kissing. Richard played opposite Olivia de Havilland in that picture, and she did not get along with Richard. She said that he was, quote, "a coarse-grained man with a coarse-grained charm and a talent not completely developed and a coarse-grained behavior, which makes him not like anyone else," end quote. Though they did eventually get along. Richard proved with that film that he was able to act in plays and in film. The role got him the Golden Globe Award for New Star of the Year actor, and it also got him his first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. In 1953, Richard starred in the movie The Robe. It was the first ever motion picture to be made in Cinescope. The film also got Richard his second Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. This film also got him an offer from Darryl F. Zanuck, the co-founder of 20th Century Fox. The offer was a 7-year, 7-picture, $1 million contract. That is over $11 million in today's money, but he turned it down to go home to portray Hamlet at the Old Vic. Darryl didn't like that Richard turned him down. He threatened to force Richard into the deal. So Richard said that he would take a less binding version of the deal after the Old Vic's 1953-1954 season. People were shocked that Richard told the studio no. I think we learned from the Clara Bow episodes earlier this season that actors did not have a lot of power against studios, at least during this time. The movie, The Robe, was a huge success. To celebrate, there was a party held at the actress Jean Simmons' house. At that party, Richard met the actress Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth thought that Richard was rather full of himself when she first met him. This was Richard's first thought about Elizabeth, quote, "So extraordinarily beautiful that I nearly laughed out loud. She was undeniably gorgeous. She was lavish. She was a dark, unyielding largesse. She was, in short, too bloody much. And not only that, she was totally ignoring me," end quote. Elizabeth is going to show up again a little later on in the episode. Richard was in the movie Sea Wife in 1957. This was about a nun and 3 men that were marooned on an island during World War II. Richard's character falls in love with the nun played by Joan Collins. Darryl F. Zanuck told the director, Robert Rossellini, that Richard and Joan's characters could not kiss. Robert disagreed, so he was replaced with Bob McNaught. The film bombed. Whenever Richard would have a project that did not go well, Philip would get mad. He said that he was ashamed of Sea Wife. I don't know if it was because Richard was using Philip's name, and so Philip saw it as Richard disgracing his good name anytime he had a failure in his career, or what? But he would definitely get upset about it. Richard's next film was Bitter Victory. It was also a failure. Richard wasn't the lucky one during this time. Richard and Sybil had moved to Switzerland because Richard wanted to avoid UK taxes. In 1957, Richard made £82,000, and the ruling Conservative government left Richard with £6,000 due to taxation. Richard was running out of money, so he needed to find work. He luckily got offered the play Time Remembered. It ran for 6 months. It also gave Richard his first Tony Award for Best Actor in a play. Now, I talked just a moment ago about how Philip would get upset when Richard would be in something that bombed or he didn't think was good enough. Well, the opposite of that was also true. He loved it when Richard was in something that did well. Like when Richard played Heathcliff in a TV adaptation of Wuthering Heights. It was like Philip was living vicariously through Richard. In 1959, the movie Look Back in Anger got Richard his first nomination in the Best Actor category at the British Academy Film Awards and the Golden Globe Awards. One of the most important films of Richard's career was a biopic about someone I covered earlier this season, Cleopatra. At the time, it was the most expensive movie ever made. It cost almost $40 million. This movie turned out to be big for Richard's personal life as well. Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra, and Richard played Mark Antony. Richard and Elizabeth started an affair while filming, even though Richard was still married to Sybil, and Elizabeth was still married to the singer Eddie Fisher. Now, this wasn't new territory for Richard. Richard had affairs all the time. The man was known for sleeping with his co-stars like Claire Bloom and Gene Simmons. He would even sneak into Jean's house at night. Jean and her husband, Stuart Granger, did not sleep in the same room, and Richard would sneak out of his house and then sneak into Jean's house, have sex with her, and then go home to a sleeping Sybil. It is estimated that Richard slept with about 2,500 women in his lifetime. The story with Elizabeth goes that at first they didn't like each other, but that changed when they filmed their first scene together. The night before, Richard had went on a drinking binge, and he hadn't slept in 2 nights. He was trying to drink a cup of coffee, but his hands were shaky. So he asked Elizabeth to hold it up to his mouth. They fell for each other then. Richard said, quote, "I fell in love at once. She was like a mirage of beauty of the ages, irresistible like the pull of gravity." End quote. The affair was obvious. Eddie Fisher could not bear to be on set and watch Richard and Elizabeth flirt. Sybil figured that it would fizzle out like the rest of his affairs. It did not. And their affair didn't just have an effect on their respective marriages. It had an impact on the world. Sure, the world before this had taken interest in celebrities, but not like this. No, not like this. Richard and Elizabeth basically invented the paparazzi when photos of them kissing on yachts in the Mediterranean and them walking around Rome were taken. Even Richard was shocked by the attention his affair with Elizabeth got. Richard told a publicist working on Cleopatra, quote, "I've had affairs before. How did I know the woman was so fucking famous? She knocks Khrushchev off the front page." End quote. The Vatican even had something to say to them about their affair. Well, they had something to say to Elizabeth. They charged her with erotic vagrancy because she was having an affair while she was still married to Eddie Fisher. Richard was not equally held accountable, even though he was still married to Sybil, because of double standards and all that. Taylor Swift said it best. Fuck the patriarchy. But their marriages to Sybil and Eddie did end, and Richard and Elizabeth got married in Montreal, Canada on March 15th, 1964. Richard was 38 and Elizabeth was 32. This was Richard's second marriage and Elizabeth's fifth. They continued to be hounded wherever they went, but one day they dreamt of a quiet life. It would be a dream that would never come true. They went on to star in other movies together. They would do 11 movies in total together, including the movie Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Elizabeth got an Oscar for that. Richard did not. Jealousy started to enter the marriage. One day they would love each other, and the next they would hate each other. Richard's cheating, like his affair with the actress Natalie Delaune, or when he flirted with Princess Margaret at a party, and his alcoholism did not help the marriage. Richard's drinking had been bad before, but it got even worse in 1968. In 1968, Richard had been drinking with his brother Ivor. Ivor slipped and fell and broke his neck. The fall left him paralyzed from the neck down. Ivor died in 1972. Richard's brother Graham thought that Richard had guilt about the situation, and that caused him to drink even more. Elizabeth's children also did not like Richard, but Richard and Elizabeth continued on. They actually liked fighting with each other. This is Richard, quote, "We will often pitch a battle purely for the exercise. I will accuse her of being ugly. She will accuse me of being a talentless son of a bitch. And this sort of frightens people. I love arguing with Elizabeth, except when she is in the nude," end quote. When Elizabeth was married to Eddie, she started the process to adopt a child named Maria. Elizabeth divorced Eddie before the adoption process was finalized. So Richard ended up adopting Maria. Richard also adopted Elizabeth's daughter, Liza Todd. Liza was a child that Elizabeth had with her third husband, Mike Todd. Mike died during his marriage to Elizabeth. Eddie Fisher adopted Liza when he was married to Elizabeth. And then Richard adopted Liza during his marriage to Elizabeth. Richard and Elizabeth lived a life of excess. Richard once used a $1.25 million check as a bookmark. He bought a $960,000 jet plane on a whim. They had homes in Mexico, Switzerland, and Ireland. They had expensive paintings, including some by someone that I mentioned last episode, the sleazeball, Augustus John. Richard bought Elizabeth jewels. He bought Elizabeth a 33.19 carat crump diamond and a pearl once owned by Spanish royalty and the Bonapartes. They lived a life that was even too grand for Hollywood, so they mainly stayed in Europe, and Richard was often bored with the lifestyle. Elizabeth wrote this letter to Richard on their 10th wedding anniversary, quote, "My darling, my still, my husband, I wish I could tell you of my love for you, of my fear, my delight, my pure animal pleasure of you, with you, my jealousy, my pride, my anger at you at times, most of all my love for you, and whatever love you can dole out to me. I wish I could write about it, but I can't. I can only boil and bubble inside, and hope you understand how I really feel. Anyway, I lust thee still, wife. P.S. Love, let us never take each other for granted again. How about that? 10 years, end quote. But 10 more years was not in the future for them. The fights, smashed TVs, and trashed hotel rooms were just too much, and they divorced in 1974. But they didn't stay divorced long. On October 10th, 1975, they married a second time. It was a secret ceremony on the banks of a river in Botswana. But that marriage ended in divorce too. They divorced on July 29th, 1976. Elizabeth once said, quote, "I love Richard with every fiber of my soul, but we cannot be together," end quote. They divorced, but they remained friends for the rest of Richard's life. Elizabeth was not Richard's last love. Between his first marriage and his second marriage to Elizabeth, Richard was engaged to Princess Elizabeth of Yugoslavia. After Richard divorced Elizabeth Taylor, he married the model Susie Miller 1 month after the divorce. Richard met Susie at a Swiss ski resort. Susie was married to her first husband, Formula One race driver James Hunt, when she met Richard, and Richard was still married to Elizabeth for the second time. Susie left James for Richard, and Richard left Elizabeth for Susie. Richard allegedly paid James $1 million as a part of the divorce settlement between Susie and James. Richard was 50 years old when he got with Susie, and Susie was 26. Susie tried to get Richard to quit drinking, and she was nearly successful. There was one time he tried the medication antabuse. That drug helps the treatment of chronic alcoholism. He blamed his alcoholism for his marriage with Elizabeth falling apart. Richard and Susie were married for 6 years. Susie filed for divorce from Richard in 1982. Richard's fourth and final marriage was to a freelance production assistant named Sally Kay. Richard met Sally on the set of a TV miniseries that Richard was in. The TV miniseries was called Wagner. Richard married Sally on July 3rd, 1983 in Las Vegas, Nevada. Susie was 38 and Richard was 58 years old. Females weren't the only gender that Richard liked to sleep with. In an interview in February of 1975 with his friend David Lewin, Richard admitted that he tried homosexuality and that all actors were latent homosexuals that covered it up with drink. Author Ellis Ambern even claimed that Richard had an affair with Laurence Olivier and that he may have tried to have sex with Elizabeth Taylor's ex-husband, Eddie Fisher, while Elizabeth was still married to him. Richard's brother Grimm said that the claim that Richard was gay is ridiculous. When it came to politics, Richard was left-leaning. He was a lifelong socialist. In 1972, he said that he was a communist while filming in Yugoslavia, and he felt no contradiction by earning a lot of money and being on the left side of politics because he said, quote, "Unlike capitalists, I don't exploit other people," end quote. He loved the subject of next week's episode, Robert F. Kennedy. He even got in a sonnet quoting contest with him. Although he once played Winston Churchill in a Walk with Destiny, aka The Gathering Storm, Richard did not like Winston. He was actually permanently banned from BBC Productions for writing 2 newspaper articles where he questioned Winston's sanity. He hated Winston and other leaders in World War II. He hated them for allegedly promising to wipe out all Japanese people on the planet. Richard was also an atheist, which I find interesting since he once thought about going into religion as a career. Richard said this, quote, "I wish I could believe in a god of some kind, but I simply cannot," end quote. Richard's biographer, Robert Sellers, said that Richard drank 3 to 4 bottles of hard liquor a day. His brother Grimm also said that Richard smoked at least 100 cigarettes a day. In 1974, Richard almost drank himself to death. He filmed a lot of his scenes in the movie The Klansman drunk. He had to film some of the scenes sitting or lying down because he could not stand. By 41, he had bursitis, arthritis, dermatitis, cirrhosis of the liver, and kidney disease. In his mid-40s, he had a limp, and on August 5th, 1984, Richard died from an intracerebral hemorrhage at his home in Salines, Switzerland. He was 58 years old. He was buried at the old cemetery of Salines with a copy of Dylan Thomas' poems. Richard was nominated for 7 Oscars in his lifetime, but he won none. He was halfway to an EGOT. He had a Grammy and 2 Tonys. He has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. It is at 6336 Hollywood Boulevard, in case you ever want to visit it. He was inducted into the Theater Hall of Fame. Richard was depicted in the films Burton and Taylor, Liz and Dick, and Liz the Elizabeth Taylor Story, and also in the play Cleo. There is a bronze statue in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, of Richard and Elizabeth Taylor, and Taylor Swift mentions Richard in her song Ready for It. It is track 1 off of her 6th studio album, Reputation. And that was the life of Richard Burton. Thank you so much for listening to the 13th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf. And also thank you for coming back after I took a break from last week. I just had a lot of stressful things that was going on, and I won't bore you with my personal life, but I just needed to take it off. Next week's episode is going to be about Robert F. Kennedy. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store. Or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose a theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of things mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the zip-up pudding. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you take out ad space on this podcast. There are also some affiliated links. There's one for Riverside, there's one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. And if you click on one of those affiliated links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, you don't want any of the perks, and you want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I've turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is just to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.